The snow is falling sideways. Bitter wind howls through the cracks in the barracks. A child coughs in the dark. Somewhere outside, a soldier's boots crunch across the frozen earth. Inside the walls of Fort Robinson, hundreds of Northern Cheyenne wait, hungry, cold, and surrounded. They know what's coming. They just don't know when. It's January, 1879, but the story begins months earlier. The Northern Cheyenne had been driven south, forced into the parched, disease-ridden reservations of Indian Territory, hundreds of miles from their homeland. It wasn't just exile. It was starvation. The food was rotting. The rivers ran dry. Children were dying. And the Cheyenne leaders, Dull Knife and Little Wolf, knew they couldn't endure another year. They had no treaty, no permission, and no supplies. But they had a direction. North. So they ran. In September of 1878, nearly 300 men, women, and children fled the reservation and began the long journey home. For weeks, they rode through Kansas, past military outposts and settlements, always pursued. Sometimes they were fired on, sometimes they fired back, but they kept moving. They didn't want war, they wanted to go home. Eventually, the band split. Little Wolf led one group west, avoiding the military and pushing toward Montana. Dull Knife led the other eastward, aiming for the Lakota agencies in Nebraska, hoping to find protection among relatives. But by October, Dull Knife's group, exhausted, starving, many on foot, was intercepted near the White River. They surrendered peacefully. U.S. troops escorted the survivors to Fort Robinson, a military post nestled against the rocky hills of Nebraska. There, they were promised shelter for the winter and told they might be allowed to remain in the North. But that promise was a lie. In early January, orders came down from Washington. The Cheyenne were to be returned south immediately, back to Indian Territory. When Dull Knife and his people refused, the commandant escalated. First, the soldiers cut off food, then water, then heat. The temperature outside dipped below zero. Inside the wooden barracks, the people burned scraps of clothing to keep warm. Infants whimpered in the dark. Elders fell silent, and still, they would not agree to return. 5 days passed in the cold. Then the silence broke. Just before midnight on January 9th, the breakout began. They tore through the doors, smashed open windows. Those who had smuggled weapons fired. Others ran into the dark with nothing but desperation. Mothers carried children. Men shielded wives. The guards opened fire. The hills lit up with muzzle flashes. And still, dozens escaped into the frozen night. The military response was swift. Over the next 2 weeks, patrols hunted the fugitives down across the snowbound plains. Few were spared. At least 64 were killed. Some were shot. Others froze where they fell. The white drifts swallowed their footprints. Entire families were gone. Dull Knife was among the survivors. Wounded, frostbitten, and heartsick, he and the last few made their way to Red Cloud Agency, where the Lakota took them in. It was there, finally, that the government relented. The survivors were allowed to remain in the North, but the price had already been paid in blood. History would call it the Fort Robinson Outbreak, but it was never a rebellion. It wasn't about vengeance or conquest. It was the final act of a people who had been backed into a corner and chose to die in the snow rather than be buried in silence. Dull Knife would live long enough to see his people settle in the northern plains. He never took up arms again, but he never forgot the price of coming home. Today, the old fort is a museum. There are placards and exhibits, brochures and walking tours. But in winter, when the wind cuts through the hills just right, the past still stirs in the snowdrifts. Not as a whisper, as a warning. Some stories do not end with surrender. Some end with a door splintering in the dark and footsteps running toward the cold. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.